What's up guys, Sean here, and today I'm going to be busting one of the biggest political myths that we always hear every election cycle. Real quick, I want to thank and recommend Scuba Steve, aka Stephen Michael Davis, aka Stephen Michael Davis, that PH is really throwing me off, because a couple of lines in one of his videos actually got me interested in this topic, and then made me start doing research for this video, and it wouldn't have been possible without me seeing that and that sparking my interest. So go over and subscribe to his channel. This is not a paid advertisement. You don't have to subscribe to his channel. In fact, you could go over and leave him a mean comment if you want. You don't have to. I kind of like the guy, so I'd appreciate it if you didn't leave him a mean comment, but this has gone on too long. Now, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but there's currently a presidential election afoot. Now, personally, I am not a fan of presidential election season because it's way too long. The Democratic candidates have been running for president since January of '09 for an election that's going to happen in November of 2009, and that's just officially. In reality, a lot of these people have been running for president since before Donald Trump was even sworn into office as president. It's way too long, it's way too annoying, and one of the things that makes presidential elections feel nearly unbearable is that politicians continuously pander in the same exact way to the same exact part of the country. And of course, I'm talking about the Rust Belt. Now, due to the fact that many of the purple states, the swing states in presidential elections, are along what is called the Rust Belt, it seems like every single politician running for president is A, talking about how they're going to save the Rust Belt, and B, talking about how their political opponents are in fact the ones who killed the Rust Belt. Now, this type of pandering takes many distinct and unique forms during our presidential cycles, whether it's NAFTA or trade deals with China that are outsourcing the jobs from the Rust Belt to countries with lower wages that our workers just can't compete with, or the evil billionaire superclass who signed on to trade deals like NAFTA and ones with China that shift off our jobs overseas to low-wage countries to increase their profits, or it's the Democratic elite who don't care about middle America, so they sign trade deals like NAFTA and ones with China to shift our jobs overseas for elitist, sinister purposes. Yeah, it's actually not that original, and it's a surprisingly bipartisan issue when it comes to blaming the trade deals for the problems in the Midwest. So I decided to actually look into this issue and diagnose who or what is the thing that actually killed the Midwest? What killed the Rust Belt? And a good place to start when trying to answer the question who or what killed the Rust Belt is what is the Rust Belt? Why is it called the Rust Belt? And what I found out is the reason why the Rust Belt is called the Rust Belt is because the Rust Belt is near sources of water, specifically navigable rivers that help transport goods. Now, you might have heard in your time on the internet about the geographical advantages the United States had over other countries, most notably the fact that the United States mainland is surrounded by two oceans blocking the United States from other foreign powers that could interfere with the development of the country. But second on that list would be the number of navigable rivers that the United States was blessed with. Now, to give you an idea of how important a navigable river is to a nation, I'm going to show you this map of this line that's called the Fall Zone or the Fall Line on the eastern third of the United States. Now, I don't want to give you a technical geographical explanation of what this line represents in nerdy technical terms, but a basic way to understand the importance of this line is that to the right of it, the eastern half of this line, the rivers will run smoothly, and to the left of this line, the rivers will be choppy and more like rapids. Now, here's a different map that shows you all of the major cities that are located on that fall line. Cities like Baltimore, Washington, D.C., Richmond, Virginia, all the way down to Columbus, Georgia, and Montgomery, Alabama. Now, if you wanted to be intentionally obtuse, you'd say, Sean, sure, that's an interesting line, that's an interesting geographical fact, but all of these cities being located on that fall line could just be a coincidence. It could have nothing to do with navigable rivers. What are you even talking about? And while I wouldn't take that seriously, because if you believe that all of these cities locating there were coincidental, I wouldn't take you seriously, but I have an example for you that illustrates exactly why having access to a navigable river is incredibly important. Let's say you wanted to get something from Pittsburgh to New York City, from Nya to Nya. Now, if you Google the distance between New York City and Pittsburgh, you'll come up with about 325 miles. If you do the Google Maps function, that adds up to about a 379-mile drive, and it's 6 hours, which is pretty manageable. You could get there in one day. However, for most of the history of the United States, you would never, and I mean never, ship large portions of cargo directly over land from Pittsburgh to New York City. The way you would get something from Pittsburgh to New York City is by putting it on a boat and sending it from the Ohio River to the Mississippi River, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and then around the Atlantic coast of the United States to New York City. Now that may sound incredibly absurd to you, but up until very recently, transportation was considered a huge cost barrier to any business. For most of human history, driving something from Pittsburgh to New York was not a thing, and even when it was a thing, it was prohibitively expensive and always way less expensive to ship it by water. Now, because at this time, water transportation is the most efficient form of transportation, the most important river in the United States of America is the Mississippi River, making the most important city in the United States of America, at least from a strategic point, the city of New Orleans, which is where the mouth of the Mississippi River goes. Now, for you history dorks out there, you'll know that the border of the United States was the Mississippi River, and Louisiana was controlled by France. This is one of the key reasons that Thomas Jefferson, who was a strict constitutionalist when he took office, fudged his constitutional powers to make the Louisiana Purchase. Because not only did you expand the American landmass to nearly double its size, but you also gain control from a foreign European power of the most important city on the continent. Which brings us forward once again to Andrew Jackson. Now, there's a tendency in American society today to attempt to diminish the accomplishments of past figures based on the worst things that they've done according to modern day morality standards. And this is especially true with somebody like Andrew Jackson. Now, I want to start this off by saying that I, too, disagree with Andrew Jackson. I don't think owning slaves is good. I know it's ridiculously stupid that I have to say this, but according to modern society, I do, and I'm virtuous for doing so. And I also did not like the Trail of Tears. In fact, if I had a time machine and I could go back in time to when Andrew Jackson was president, I'd look him in the face and tell him he's a very bad man and I don't approve of him, and all people in the future don't approve of him. So can we move past that, and can I start talking about why Andrew Jackson is actually important? No? Well, I'm going to do it anyway. So although it's a bit of an oversimplification, Andrew Jackson became a war hero in the War of 1812 due to the fact that he won the Battle of New Orleans. Now, the people who will try to diminish this accomplishment will point out that this battle happened when the war was technically over. And while it is true the peace treaty for the war was signed, that had not made it to either the British or the American forces. And Andrew Jackson still held off a British invasion of the most strategically important city in the United States of America against the undisputed greatest naval power in history. And he did it while his forces were significantly outnumbered and completely untrained and undisciplined. He put together an army of volunteers and took it up against the greatest army in world history at that point, and won. And by the way, even though the war was technically over and the peace treaty with the British was technically signed, it's not like the British Empire isn't known for capturing strategic points in other countries and holding it for a long time. In fact, the British still, to this day, hold a number of overseas territories that they found strategically important in the past. So regardless on whether or not you would join me on my time travel trip to lecture Andrew Jackson about how bad, mean, and racialist he is, this was a legitimate accomplishment, and he was already one of the most accomplished generals throughout the war, winning the Creek War. So if you were under the impression that Andrew Jackson was some idiot who decided to randomly attack British soldiers as they were leaving, then you have the Battle of New Orleans completely wrong. If you thought that the American people were idiots back in the day and they elected a guy who won a battle after the war was over out of pure ignorance, you were also wrong. Everybody in the United States of America, or at least a vast majority of the educated people in the United States of America, knew how important New Orleans was, and that's why Andrew Jackson's victory was celebrated from then on, and that's why he won the presidency. So now that you guys have an understanding about the importance of having navigable rivers in your country and how they are important not only economically but strategically, it will be unsurprising for most of you to know or learn that the Midwestern cities that we're talking about, the Rust Belt, are all cities that are along rivers. Pittsburgh, Steeltown is literally a city on three rivers. That's why the stadium that used to be in Pittsburgh was called Three River Stadium. Important cities in Ohio are along the Ohio River, Chicago has the Chicago River, and Detroit has the Detroit River. And a lot of these rivers, whether it's an end-around route or not, end up connecting to the Mississippi, which is essential for shipping goods outside the nation. However, that only tells half the story, because if you notice by looking at a map of the United States of America, there's a ton of rivers across the country, and the Mississippi River is so important because it extends from north of the United States of America all the way down south to the Gulf of Mexico. So logically, it would make sense for the Rust Belt to have formed along the Mississippi River, but tend to cater more towards the southern states because that's closer to the port of New Orleans, which is the most important port. But this is where the other half of the equation comes in, and that other half is climate.
How dare you?
No, not climate change, just climate. You see, the South is hot. I don't know if you guys know that. A lot of deserts down south. Not the best place to open up a factory, because inside that factory, your workers would be boiling and very unproductive. But the Midwestern cities that we all associate manufacturing with are much more moderate in terms of temperature. It wasn't a coincidence or an act of God or luck that so many American car companies started in the Midwest and specifically in Detroit. Detroit had a climate that was conducive to manufacturing cars, and they had the water, the rivers, necessary to transport those products across the country. Now, because the Midwest had not only the temperature advantage, but the transportation of goods advantage, this led to another phenomenon that we associate with the Midwest, and that's unionization. You ever wonder why the heads of these major corporations that definitely did not want their workers to unionize for better wages didn't just pack up their factories and relocate somewhere else? Well, the answer is they literally could not pack up their factories and relocate somewhere else. They were in the ideal place, and anywhere else would have been more expensive than actually paying the workers the union wages that they demanded. So in reality, the so-called golden age for the American worker, the golden age for unions, when a union manufacturing job could pay a middle-class wage, had nothing to do with federal laws that were protectionist in nature. It had nothing to do with the lack of trade agreements with other countries. The factories had to be located there because there were no other options within the United States, much less without the United States, especially in the post-World War II era. Now, of course, that eventually changed because otherwise I wouldn't be making this video, but it wasn't due to trade deals like NAFTA or opening up trade with China. It wasn't due to greedy millionaires and billionaires. It was due to the fact that we made advancements in transportation. If you look at the dip in manufacturing jobs across the country, their dip coincides almost exactly with the advent of cheaper ground-based transportation throughout the country. But again, just like transportation costs were only half the story in the creation of the Midwest, there was another invention to offset the climate issue, and that invention was air conditioning. You couldn't manufacture things before in the much cheaper, non-unionized South because it was just too hot to do so. But all of a sudden, with the invention of air conditioning, you could have people working in air-conditioned factories anywhere in the country and be more comfortable than they ever would have been in the Midwest without that air conditioning. This is why companies that we view to be foreign car companies like Volvo, BMW, Toyota, and even companies that make golf carts do make cars in the United States of America, but they make them in South Carolina, not in Detroit. Look, the reality is that the decline of manufacturing that politicians are always trying to blame on trade deals and always promising political solutions for actually started decades before the very trade deals that they're trying to pin the problems on were even signed into law. The reason the Rust Belt as we knew it was able to exist was due to geographic advantages that no longer play as big a role in the economy as they used to. The leverage that union workers in the Rust Belt used to have no longer exists anymore, and now states with much more lax labor laws are reaping the benefits of those lax labor laws. Huge portions of this country used to be virtually unlivable, but now we can have manufacturing plants and build gigantic cities in those parts of the country. There's a great article that I'm going to link in the description box of this video that kind of tells the tale, but in a different way, from Salon from 2008, and it's written by an author who is lamenting the fact that air conditioning exists because they believe that the invention of air conditioning is what allowed George W. Bush to become president twice. Now, while the article is fun, it's also incredibly telling because in the article, they cite the population numbers of the state of Florida in the year 1924, which is almost 100 years ago. And that population number for the entire peninsula of Florida was 1 million people. Now Florida is the third most populous state in the union at 21 million people. And that 21 million number is actually up significantly from 2007 when this article was written, when Florida's population was only 15 million. Florida, like many other places throughout this country, because of air conditioning, went from unlivable to actually pretty nice to live in. And that same invention, air conditioning, that made the Florida population surge possible, also made it very possible to relocate factories there. Now look, I'm not saying that trade deals have absolutely no impact on the economy of the United States of America. If they had no impact, we wouldn't have done the trade deals. Obviously, there are trade-offs. Some sectors are going to lose out because foreign goods won't be tariffed and it's easier to produce those goods in other parts of the world. But overall, it has been proven time after time that despite specific losers in these trade deals, they have been largely beneficial for the United States of America and its citizens. Can there be improvements made to these trade deals? 100%. Is there and has there been in the past terrible language in some of these trade deals that is meant to obstruct the United States sovereignty? 100%. But even if you got your ideal person in the White House and a Congress that was 100% on his side, and they constructed a trade deal meant to bring back all of the jobs that you specifically want back, there is no indication, and in fact evidence to the contrary, that those jobs will go back to the same locations that you remember them in. Because even within this country, there is no economic advantage to having those jobs located there. But those are my thoughts. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you like this video, then please show me by leaving a like. You can subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social medias. If you want to support me, you can do so via PayPal, Venmo, Subscribestar, or Patreon, or you can buy something from my Teespring store. This has been me talking about the history of the Rust Belt and why it declined. Till next time.